The fluorescent lights in the corridor of Atlanta Memorial Hospital flickered at 2:47 a.m., casting harsh shadows across linoleum floors that had been scrubbed clean, but still carried the antiseptic smell of countless emergencies. Denise Washington stood motionless against the wall, her right arm throbbing where the needle had drawn 2 pints of her O-negative blood just 3 hours earlier. The small bandage felt tight against her dark skin, a reminder of the choice she'd made without hesitation when the doctor announced they were critically low on her blood type. Through the narrow window of room 314, she could see Marcus Wellington III slumped in the visitor's chair beside his grandfather's hospital bed, his normally perfect blonde hair disheveled from running his hands through it, his expensive suit wrinkled from hours of anxious waiting. Harold Wellington's chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm that had nearly stopped forever. The monitors beside his bed beeped softly, each sound a confirmation that the transfusion had worked, that the internal bleeding had been stopped in time. At 82, Harold's weathered hands lay still against the white hospital blanket, the same hands that had built Wellington Industries from a small construction company into a $2 billion empire spanning 3 states. Those hands had signed contracts worth millions, had guided Marcus through childhood after his parents died in that terrible accident on I-285, and had trembled slightly during recent months as mild cognitive decline began to cloud the sharp mind that had intimidated competitors and comforted his grandson in equal measure. The doctor's words still echoed in Denise's mind as she watched the peaceful scene through the glass. "Without that blood donation, Mr. Wellington would have died from internal hemorrhaging within 60 minutes. The elderly man sleeping in that bed had no idea that his life had been saved by the woman who served his coffee every morning in the blue ceramic mug he'd used for 20 years, who knew he preferred his scrambled eggs slightly runny and his bacon crisp, who had quietly managed the household details that kept his world running smoothly while he focused on business and family. Marcus shifted in his chair, his 19-year-old face showing the strain of the longest night of his life since losing his parents. He had no idea who the anonymous blood donor was, though he'd spent hours wondering about the stranger who had stepped forward when the hospital's blood bank came up short. Tomorrow, he would learn the truth, and that discovery would crack open assumptions about class, competence, and care that had governed the Wellington family for generations, revealing fault lines that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The crisis had started 12 hours earlier in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Wellington Industries' downtown headquarters on Ivan Allen Boulevard, where the late autumn light filtered through tall windows overlooking the sprawling city that Harold had watched grow and change for 5 decades. The federal audit meeting had been scheduled for 9 a.m., a final session to determine whether the company would face criminal charges over labor practice violations or could negotiate a settlement that would allow them to continue operating without the shadow of government prosecution hanging over every decision. Marcus had arrived early, his navy Tom Ford suit pressed to perfection, his Italian leather shoes polished to mirror brightness, every detail calculated to project the confidence he didn't quite feel. At 19, he was technically old enough to inherit control of the family business, but he knew the board members still saw him as the scared 8-year-old who had cried at his parents' funeral, not the capable executive he desperately wanted to become. He'd spent the previous evening in his bedroom at the Buckhead mansion, practicing his presentation in front of the mirror, trying to anticipate every question the federal investigators might ask about employee classifications, wage structures, and benefit policies that had been in place since before he was born. Harold had insisted on attending despite his recent memory lapses, episodes where he would forget familiar names or lose track of conversations mid-sentence, moments that terrified Marcus because they suggested his grandfather's formidable mind was beginning to betray him. "No government bureaucrat is going to hear about my business without me being in the room," Harold had declared over breakfast, his voice carrying the authority that had once silenced hostile takeover attempts and union negotiations. But Marcus had noticed the slight tremor in his grandfather's hands as he buttoned his shirt, the way he paused at the top of the stairs, as if momentarily uncertain which direction led to his study. From the kitchen of the mansion, Denise had listened to these familiar morning tensions, while she prepared Harold's medication organizer and Marcus's travel coffee mug. She'd been working for the Wellington family for 3 years, hired by Marcus's mother just 2 months before the car accident that had changed everything. Catherine Wellington had been specific in her instructions. Harold and Marcus need someone who pays attention to details, someone who can manage the house without making them feel managed. In the years since Catherine's death, Denise had learned to read the rhythms of grief and responsibility that shaped the daily life of the 2 men who had become her primary concern. She knew that Marcus paced the marble foyer when he was nervous, wearing a path between the antique console table and the grandfather clock that had belonged to Harold's father. She knew that Harold became more stubborn when he felt his authority questioned, clinging to familiar routines and business decisions as anchors against the confusion that sometimes clouded his thoughts. She knew that both men avoided direct conversations about Harold's cognitive changes, dancing around the subject with careful politeness that left important questions unasked and unanswered. The pre-meeting dinner had been held at Harold's downtown office, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Centennial Olympic Park. The room was filled with the accumulated artifacts of a long business career, framed photographs of construction projects, awards from trade associations, a signed baseball from the 1995 World Series when the Braves had brought championship glory to Atlanta. Harold's mahogany desk, large enough to seat 8 people, had been cleared except for legal documents related to the federal audit and a crystal water pitcher that caught the late afternoon light streaming through the windows. Marcus had been reviewing his notes one final time when he noticed his grandfather's face changing. Harold, who had been arguing with their lawyer about disclosure requirements just moments before, suddenly gripped the edge of the conference table, his knuckles white against the dark wood. His face drained of color, becoming pale as the starched white shirt he wore to every important meeting. "Something's wrong," he whispered, his voice tight with pain and confusion. The transformation was terrifyingly swift. One moment Harold was the commanding presence who had intimidated competitors and inspired employees for 5 decades. The next, he was doubled over in his leather chair, clutching his stomach as if trying to hold himself together through sheer will. Marcus had seen his grandfather face down hostile board members and union leaders without flinching, had watched him negotiate million-dollar deals with steady hands and calm voice. But this enemy was internal, invisible, and utterly beyond Harold's ability to control or intimidate. Marcus's hands shook as he dialed 911, his voice cracking as he tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher. The lawyer, a thin man named Peterson who had worked with the Wellington family for 15 years, knelt beside Harold's chair, loosening his tie and checking his pulse with the awkward competence of someone who had taken a first aid course but hoped never to use it. Harold's breathing became shallow, rapid, and his eyes carried a confusion that went beyond physical pain into something closer to fear. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, its red and blue lights reflecting off the glass facades of the downtown office buildings as paramedics rushed through the lobby with equipment that seemed both reassuring and ominous. Marcus followed the stretcher to the elevator, watching his grandfather's face for signs of recognition, for any indication that the man who had raised him was still present behind the mask of pain and medical necessity. At the hospital, the emergency room became a blur of urgent voices and efficient movement. Dr. Patricia Chen, the attending physician, was a compact woman in her 40s, whose calm demeanor suggested she had managed countless similar crises. She listened to the paramedic's report while examining Harold, her hands moving with practiced confidence as she assessed his condition and ordered tests that would reveal the extent of the internal damage. "He's lost significant blood internally," Dr. Chen explained to Marcus in the hallway outside the examination room, her voice carrying the kind of professional compassion that acknowledged both medical reality and human emotion. "We need to get him into surgery immediately, but first we need to replace what he's lost. He's type O negative, and our blood bank is running critically low on that type. We need donors, and we need them now." Marcus immediately rolled up his sleeve, ready to give whatever was needed to save his grandfather's life. He'd never been particularly close to Harold in the emotional sense. Their relationship was built more on respect and duty than on shared affection. But Harold was the only family he had left, the man who had stepped into the role of parent when that accident on the interstate had left an 8-year-old boy alone in the world, except for servants and trustees and distant relatives who viewed him more as an inheritance problem than as a grieving child. The blood test revealed what Marcus had never thought to know about himself. He was type A positive, incompatible with his grandfather's urgent need. Peterson, the family lawyer, volunteered next, but his type B negative blood was equally useless. 2 nurses were called in from other departments, but neither matched the specific requirements that would allow them to donate the O negative blood that was literally the difference between life and death for Harold Wellington. Marcus stood in the sterile hallway, surrounded by the antiseptic smell and fluorescent lighting of institutional medicine, feeling more helpless than he had since childhood. All his family's wealth, all the connections and resources that had smoothed every path throughout his 19 years, meant nothing in the face of this biological reality. Money couldn't buy the specific type of blood that his grandfather needed, and influence couldn't speed up the biological processes that would determine whether Harold lived through the next hour. That's when Denise appeared at his elbow, her voice quiet but clear in the chaos of the emergency room. She had followed the ambulance from downtown in her 10-year-old Honda Civic, navigating Atlanta traffic with the same careful competence she brought to every task, arriving at the hospital just as the medical team was explaining Harold's critical need for type O negative blood. "I'm O negative," she said simply, the words cutting through Marcus's panic like a lifeline he hadn't known he was hoping for. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. The blood donation process took place in a small room adjacent to the emergency department, where Denise lay on a narrow bed surrounded by medical equipment that hummed with quiet efficiency. A young technician named Robert, whose gentle manner suggested experience with nervous donors, inserted the needle into her right arm with practiced skill. Denise watched her blood flow through clear plastic tubing into sterile bags that would soon be carrying her life force into Harold Wellington's failing circulatory system. During the 45 minutes required to draw the 2 pints of blood that would save Harold's life, Denise thought about the strange circumstances that had brought her to this moment. 3 years earlier, she had been working 2 part-time jobs, cleaning offices downtown and stocking shelves at the Kroger on Ponce de Leon Avenue, when Catherine Wellington had found her through a placement agency that specialized in domestic staff for Atlanta's wealthier families. The interview had taken place in the sunlit breakfast room of the Buckhead mansion, where Catherine had served coffee in delicate china cups and asked questions that went beyond the usual inquiries about experience and references. "I need someone who can manage a household without making the men in it feel managed," Catherine had explained. "My husband's father lives with us, and he's used to being in charge of everything. My son is 11 and still learning how to be part of a family after some difficult years. They both need care, but they won't accept it if it feels like pity or control." Denise had understood instinctively what Catherine meant. She had grown up in a family where her grandmother had managed a household of 8 people with such skill that everyone felt cared for without feeling diminished. where love was expressed through attention to details rather than dramatic gestures, where respect was earned through competence rather than demanded through authority. The Wellington family needed someone who could provide that kind of invisible support, and Denise had recognized the challenge as something she was uniquely qualified to handle. The tragedy had struck just 2 months after Denise started working for the family. The call came on a Tuesday evening in October, when autumn leaves were beginning to turn red and gold in the wealthy neighborhoods north of the city. Catherine and her husband David had been driving home from a charity dinner when their Mercedes was struck by a drunk driver who ran a red light at the intersection of Peachtree and Piedmont. Both died instantly, leaving 11-year-old Marcus and 68-year-old Harold to figure out how to be a family without the woman who had been the emotional center of their world. In the weeks following the funeral, Denise had watched 2 very different kinds of grief reshape the daily life of the mansion. Harold threw himself into work with even greater intensity, spending 12- and 14-hour days at the office as if business problems could somehow distract him from the loss of his beloved daughter-in-law. Marcus became quiet and watchful, polite in the way that traumatized children learn to be when they're trying not to cause additional problems for the adults who are struggling to care for them. Denise's role in the household had evolved gradually from housekeeper to something more complex and essential. She learned to read Harold's moods and energy levels, serving breakfast earlier when he seemed restless, and later when he appeared tired. She learned to anticipate Marcus's needs during the difficult transition from private elementary school to the prestigious prep school that would prepare him for college and eventual leadership of the family business. She became the keeper of family routines and traditions that might otherwise have been lost in the chaos of grief and adjustment. As Harold's blood flowed into the collection bags, Denise reflected on the thousands of small observations that had taught her to see both men clearly. She knew that Harold's short-term memory problems were worse when he was stressed, that he responded better to gentle suggestions than direct requests, that he felt most confident when he could connect new information to business knowledge he had accumulated over 5 decades. She knew that Marcus was more mature than his age suggested, but still desperately needed the approval of the grandfather who had become his primary parent figure. Most importantly, she knew that both men were fundamentally decent people who had been shaped by circumstances beyond their control, who were trying to maintain dignity and purpose while navigating challenges that their wealth and social position had not prepared them to handle. Harold's mild cognitive decline was frightening for him because it threatened the mental acuity that had been his primary source of identity and power. Marcus's youth was a burden because it meant that every decision he made was scrutinized by adults who remembered him as a child and questioned whether he had earned the authority he would eventually inherit. The blood donation was completed just as Harold was being prepped for emergency surgery. Denise returned to the waiting area with a bandage on her right arm and instructions to avoid heavy lifting for 24 hours. Medical advice that seemed almost comically irrelevant given the emotional weight of the situation. Marcus was pacing the small waiting room, his cell phone pressed to his ear as he fielded calls from concerned board members who had learned about Harold's hospitalization through the network of business relationships that connected Atlanta's corporate community. "The surgery should take about 2 hours, Marcus told Denise after ending his 4th phone conversation. "Dr. Chen says the prognosis is good, but he's lost a lot of blood. She said the transfusion was critical." He paused, looking at the bandage on her arm with what seemed like growing awareness. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for thinking to follow the ambulance. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't." Denise nodded, recognizing that Marcus was processing emotions and information that would take time to fully understand. She had seen him grow from a grieving 11-year-old into a young man who was trying to balance family loyalty with personal ambition, who was learning to navigate adult responsibilities while still figuring out his own identity. Tonight's crisis would accelerate that process in ways that neither of them could yet imagine. The surgery was successful in stopping Harold's internal bleeding, but the recovery process revealed complications that went beyond the physical trauma. When Harold woke up after 36 hours in intensive care, his confusion extended beyond the expected disorientation that follows major surgery and significant blood loss. He recognized Marcus, but couldn't remember the name of the nurse who had been caring for him, couldn't recall the sequence of events that had led to his hospitalization, and seemed uncertain about details of his business that had been routine knowledge just days before. Dr. Morrison, the neurologist who was called in to assess Harold's cognitive function, was a tall man in his 50s whose calm manner suggested experience with the intersection of physical trauma and mental capacity. He spent 2 hours evaluating Harold's memory, reasoning ability and executive function, testing his ability to process new information and retrieve familiar knowledge from long-term storage. The good news is that his core cognitive abilities are intact, Dr. Morrison explained to Marcus during a consultation in the hospital's family conference room. His personality hasn't changed, his judgment seems sound, and he can engage in complex reasoning. The concerning news is that he's showing signs of short-term memory impairment and occasional confusion about time and place. Some of this may be temporary, related to the trauma and anesthesia, but some may be permanent. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced during his parents' funeral, when he first understood that some changes cannot be undone, that some losses require learning to live with permanent alterations in the basic structure of life. What does this mean for his ability to work, to make decisions about the company? That depends on several factors, including the quality of support he receives during recovery and how well his cognitive function stabilizes over the next few months. Many people with mild cognitive impairment can continue to work and make important decisions if their environment is structured to support their strengths and compensate for their limitations. The discharge planning meeting took place in a sterile conference room that smelled of disinfectant and institutional coffee. Marcus arrived early, carrying a leather portfolio filled with notes about care options and medical recommendations, determined to make decisions that would give his grandfather the best possible chance of recovery while acknowledging the new realities that would shape their lives going forward. Harold's brother John drove down from his suburban home in Roswell, his silver Lexus SUV parked beside Marcus's BMW in the hospital's visitor lot. At 65, John had spent his career in middle management positions that had provided comfortable stability without the risks and pressures that had made Harold wealthy. His wife Patricia followed in her own car, a practical Honda CR-V that reflected their family's approach to money and status, careful and conservative in ways that had sometimes irritated Harold during family gatherings. The family tension in the conference room was subtle but unmistakable, rooted in decades of polite competition and unspoken judgments about success, responsibility, and the burden of caring for aging relatives. John and Patricia had raised 3 children in a split-level ranch house, with a 2-car garage and a small backyard, creating a life that was comfortable but unremarkable. Harold had built an empire and lived in a mansion, but he had also lost his son and daughter-in-law in a tragic accident, leaving him responsible for raising a grandson while managing a complex business. "We need to be realistic about Harold's limitations," Patricia said, spreading brochures for assisted living facilities across the conference table. "He needs professional medical supervision, structured activities, and social interaction with people his own age. This isn't about hurt feelings or family dynamics. It's about providing the best possible care for someone we all love." Marcus found himself in an unexpected position, defending a decision he hadn't been sure about himself. The idea of Harold living in an institutional setting, no matter how elegant or well-staffed, felt like a betrayal of the man who had created a home where Marcus had felt safe and valued throughout his teenage years. But he also recognized that his emotional attachment to keeping Harold at home might not align with his grandfather's actual needs. "What about home care?" Marcus asked. "Professional nurses, physical therapy, whatever medical support he needs, but in familiar surroundings." John looked skeptical. "That's expensive and complicated to coordinate. And what happens if Denise gets sick or quits? What happens in a medical emergency when you're not there?" These were reasonable questions that Marcus couldn't answer with confidence. He looked at Denise, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the conference room, taking notes in her precise handwriting on the back of a hospital pamphlet. Her presence at this family meeting had been Marcus's decision, made partly because he valued her observations about Harold's condition, and partly because he was beginning to understand that she knew his grandfather in ways that the rest of the family had never learned to see. "Denise," he said, "what do you think Harold needs to recover as much as possible?" She looked up from her notes, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "He needs familiarity and routine, but he also needs medical support that I can't provide alone. I think the question isn't whether he stays home or goes to a facility, but whether we can create a care team that gives him the best of both approaches." The social worker, a thin woman with tired eyes who had managed countless similar family conferences, reviewed Harold's specific care requirements with clinical precision. He would need help managing medications, assistance with mobility during his recovery from surgery, cognitive exercises to maintain mental function, and careful monitoring for signs of infection or complications related to his recent medical crisis. "The advantage of institutional care is coordination," she explained. "Everything is managed by trained professionals according to established protocols. The advantage of home care is familiarity and emotional comfort, but it requires much more family involvement in coordinating different types of support." As the meeting progressed, Denise found herself answering detailed questions about Harold's daily routines, his preferences for food and activities, his sleep patterns, and his responses to different types of interaction. Her answers revealed a level of knowledge that surprised even Marcus, who had been living in the same house but had never paid systematic attention to the details that shaped his grandfather's comfort and well-being. "He's been having trouble with his evening medications," Denise said in response to a question about medication compliance. "He remembers to take the morning pills because that's part of his routine with breakfast, but by evening he's tired and sometimes forgets. I've been setting phone alarms and checking with him before I leave each day." Marcus realized that he had been completely unaware of this problem, despite eating dinner with Harold most evenings and spending time with him in the study afterward. The medications were managed, the problem was solved, but he had never noticed either the difficulty or the solution. "What about physical safety?" the social worker asked. "Falls, confusion, wandering. He's steady in the morning when he's rested but tired by late afternoon," Denise replied. "I moved a chair into the downstairs bathroom after he mentioned feeling dizzy, and I keep his walker near his favorite reading chair, even though he doesn't like to admit he needs it. He's never wandered or gotten lost, but sometimes he forgets what time it is and gets confused about his schedule." John and Patricia exchanged glances that Marcus interpreted as skepticism about Denise's qualifications to assess Harold's medical needs. But as the conversation continued, it became clear that her observations were more detailed and practical than the formal assessments provided by the hospital staff, and that her solutions were working to prevent problems rather than simply responding to crises after they occurred. The compromise that emerged from the meeting seemed reasonable to everyone involved. Harold would return home with Denise as his primary caregiver, but a visiting nurse would check on him twice weekly, and the family would reassess his needs after 30 days. If his condition worsened, or if home care proved inadequate, they would revisit the option of institutional placement. The plan satisfied Harold's desire to remain in familiar surroundings while addressing John and Patricia's concerns about professional medical oversight. What nobody anticipated was how much that first month would reveal about competence, care, and the assumptions that had shaped the Wellington family's relationships for decades. Harold's recovery at home would challenge everyone's understanding of who was qualified to provide effective care and what kinds of knowledge actually mattered in supporting another person's health and dignity. The first week back at the Buckhead mansion established patterns that surprised everyone. Harold, who had been a demanding and sometimes difficult patient in the hospital, cooperated readily with Denise's carefully structured routines. She had reorganized his schedule around his natural energy rhythms, serving breakfast later when he was more alert and moving his afternoon rest to the sunroom where natural light helped regulate his sleep patterns. Most significantly, she had discovered something that the hospital's occupational therapy staff had missed. Harold responded much better to familiar music than to the cognitive exercises designed by medical professionals. While he struggled with abstract memory tests, he could sing along with Nat King Cole albums from his youth, remembering not just lyrics, but biographical details about musicians and the historical context of songs that had been popular during his early career. Marcus began paying attention to details he had previously taken for granted. He noticed that Harold ate more when Denise prepared his favorite pot roast recipe, a dish that had been regular Sunday dinner throughout Marcus's childhood, but had disappeared from their routine when Harold's memory problems began. He observed that his grandfather slept better since Denise had adjusted the temperature in his bedroom and installed blackout curtains to block the streetlight that had been disturbing his rest. Most importantly, Harold had begun talking about Wellington Industries again, not with the sharp focus he had once possessed, but with enough clarity to ask relevant questions and offer insights that surprised Marcus with their strategic sophistication. During one of these conversations, Marcus realized that his grandfather was tracking business developments that should have been beyond his current cognitive capacity. "How do you know about the Patterson contract?" Marcus asked one afternoon when Harold mentioned a client deal that hadn't been finalized when he was hospitalized. Harold smiled with something approaching his old authority. "Denise reads me the company updates every Tuesday and Friday. She summarizes the important points and asks me questions to make sure I understand. I may forget what I had for breakfast, but I don't forget my business." This discovery led Marcus to realize that Denise had been maintaining Harold's connection to Wellington Industries through carefully designed briefings that kept him informed without overwhelming him with details his current processing capacity couldn't handle. She had been coordinating with Marcus's assistant to ensure Harold received relevant reports in formats that matched his cognitive abilities, and she had been helping him maintain the sense of purpose and involvement that was essential to his identity and motivation. The federal audit resolution came during Harold's third week home, when government investigators offered a settlement that would require Wellington Industries to implement new labor policies and establish an employee welfare fund, but would avoid criminal charges that could have destroyed the company's reputation and market position. The deal needed Harold's signature as majority owner, and his legal competency would be evaluated to ensure that his consent was informed and voluntary. Dr. Morrison, the neurologist, spent 2 hours with Harold on a Thursday morning, conducting the formal assessment that would determine whether his cognitive function was sufficient for him to make binding legal decisions. Marcus waited in the study, reviewing settlement documents and trying not to pace, acutely aware that the outcome of this evaluation would affect not just Harold's legal status, but the future of the family business. When Denise brought coffee to the living room, where the assessment was taking place, Marcus noticed that she moved quietly, but attentively, positioning herself where she could hear the conversation without appearing to eavesdrop. Her expression was calm but watchful, and he realized that she was monitoring Harold's performance with the same careful attention she brought to all aspects of his care. "How do you think it's going?" Marcus asked her when she returned to the kitchen. "He's having a good day," she replied simply. "Dr. Morrison is asking the right kinds of questions." "What do you mean, the right kinds?" Denise paused, choosing her words carefully. "Questions about things that matter to him personally. Not just abstract memory tests, but questions about the company, about your grandmother, about decisions he's proud of making. Mr. Harold's memory works better when it's connected to things he cares about deeply." I owned. The neurologist's report, delivered that afternoon, confirmed Harold's legal competency with specific notes about his preserved executive function and business judgment. Dr. Morrison acknowledged that Harold's short-term memory had gaps and that his processing speed was slower than it had been before his medical crisis. But his ability to understand complex information, weigh alternatives, and make reasoned decisions remained fundamentally intact. Marcus felt relief that went beyond the immediate legal implications. Harold's competency meant that he could continue to be involved in major business decisions, that the company wouldn't need to implement emergency succession plans, and that the family wouldn't need to navigate the complicated process of guardianship or conservatorship. But more than that, it meant that Harold retained the dignity and autonomy that had always been central to his sense of identity. Share your take in the comments. What felt like the turning point for you? The confrontation that had been building since Harold's return home erupted during his 4th week of recovery, when John and Patricia arrived at the mansion on a Saturday morning with a new proposal for Harold's care. They had spent the previous month researching assisted living facilities and had identified what they considered the ideal placement, a high-end community in Roswell that specialized in residents with mild cognitive impairment and offered structured activities, professional medical supervision, and social interaction with peers who shared similar challenges. "It's not about the quality of care he's receiving here," Patricia explained, as they gathered in Harold's formal living room, a space filled with antique furniture and family photographs that told the story of 3 generations of Wellington success. "Denise is doing an admirable job, and we all appreciate her dedication. But this is about giving Harold the best possible environment for long-term stability and continued improvement." John supported his wife's argument with practical considerations that Marcus found difficult to dismiss. What happens if Denise gets sick or injured? What happens if you're traveling for business when Harold has a medical emergency? What happens when his condition progresses and he needs more intensive care than one person can provide? These were the same concerns that had been raised during the hospital discharge meeting, and Marcus still didn't have confident answers. The previous month had gone smoothly, but that success might have been due to favorable circumstances that couldn't be guaranteed to continue indefinitely. Harold's cognitive function had stabilized at a level that allowed him to live semi-independently, but there was no guarantee that this stability would be permanent. Marcus found himself defending a decision that had evolved from practical necessity rather than careful planning. "Harold is doing well here," he said, aware that his voice carried a defensive tone that undermined his credibility. "His doctors are pleased with his progress. He's comfortable in familiar surroundings, and he's maintaining connections to the business that are important to his sense of purpose." "He's doing well because Denise is providing excellent care," John replied. "But that care comes with limitations that a professional facility wouldn't have. We're not questioning her competence or dedication, but we are questioning whether home care is sustainable over the long term." Harold, who had been taking his afternoon nap when John and Patricia arrived, appeared in the doorway during this discussion. He moved slowly but deliberately, using his walker with the careful dignity of someone who refused to let physical limitations diminish his presence in his own home. At 82, Harold still possessed the kind of authority that could quiet a room simply by entering it, though that authority now required more effort to summon and maintain. "I heard voices," he said, settling into his favorite leather armchair with the measured movements of someone who had learned to navigate physical challenges without appearing helpless. "John, Patricia, It's good to see you both." For the next hour, Marcus watched his uncle and aunt present their case directly to Harold, speaking with the respectful firmness that characterized their approach to family decisions. They outlined the advantages of professional care, the social opportunities available at the Roswell facility, and the peace of mind that would come from knowing Harold was receiving supervision from trained medical staff around the clock. Harold listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated his understanding of both their concerns and their proposed solution. His questions were thoughtful and relevant, showing that his cognitive function was sufficient for him to participate meaningfully in decisions about his own future. But Marcus also noticed moments when Harold seemed to lose track of details or appeared uncertain about information that should have been routine knowledge. When John and Patricia finished their presentation, Harold turned to Marcus with a directness that reminded him of the grandfather who had once intimidated corporate rivals and inspired employee loyalty through decades of business leadership. "What do you think I should do?" The question carried weight that went far beyond the immediate decision about living arrangements. Harold was asking Marcus to demonstrate judgment, to show that he had developed the capacity for leadership that would eventually be required to run Wellington Industries, to prove that he could balance competing considerations and make difficult choices under pressure. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied moments when his youth and inexperience became liabilities rather than simply personal characteristics. But he also felt something new, a clarity based on observation rather than assumption, on evidence rather than tradition, on results rather than credentials. "I think you should stay where you're happiest and healthiest," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "And right now, that seems to be here, with the care you're getting from Denise and the support systems we've built around your recovery." John's jaw tightened with frustration that was clearly rooted in years of watching his younger brother make decisions that seemed reckless but often proved successful. "Marcus, you're 19 years old. This is a medical decision that requires mature judgment based on long-term considerations, not emotional attachments to familiar surroundings." Marcus felt the sting of his uncle's dismissal, the automatic assumption that his age invalidated his observations and opinions. But instead of defensive anger, he felt a calm determination to articulate what he had learned during the past month of watching Harold's recovery, with careful attention to details that others had dismissed as unimportant. "I'm also the person who sees Harold every day," he replied, meeting John's gaze directly. "I've watched him improve since he came home. I've seen him remember things that he couldn't recall in the hospital, engage with business decisions that seemed beyond his capacity just weeks ago, sleep through the night without the confusion and agitation that plagued him during institutional care. I don't know what credentials measure that kind of progress, but I know what I've observed." Harold smiled with an expression that Marcus hadn't seen since before the hospitalization, a look of approval that suggested pride in his grandson's growing maturity and confidence. "Then it's settled," Harold said with finality. "I'm staying home." But the family tension didn't end with Harold's declaration of independence. Over the following week, Marcus began receiving phone calls from Wellington Industries board members who had been contacted by John and Patricia about Harold's situation and its potential implications for company stability and leadership continuity. The message conveyed through these conversations was diplomatic but clear. If Harold's judgment was compromised, and if Marcus was making emotional rather than rational decisions about his grandfather's care, the board might need to consider interim leadership arrangements to protect the company's interests. The pressure intensified when Harold experienced his first significant setback during his 5th week of home recovery. Marcus was downtown at the Wellington Industries headquarters, reviewing quarterly financial reports in his temporary office, when his cell phone rang with a call from an unfamiliar number that turned out to be Dr. Chen from Atlanta Memorial Hospital. "Mr. Wellington, your grandfather was brought to the emergency room about an hour ago," she said, in the calm, professional tone that medical personnel use to convey serious information without causing panic. "He fell in his bathroom this morning. We're looking at a possible hip fracture, but he's stable and conscious. We need family authorization for imaging studies and potential surgical intervention." The drive from downtown Atlanta to the hospital felt both endless and impossibly brief. 12 minutes of racing through midday traffic on surface streets that were clogged with delivery trucks and construction equipment. Marcus's mind cycled through scenarios ranging from minor injury to life-threatening complications, each possibility carrying implications that extended far beyond Harold's immediate medical needs to questions about care decisions, family authority, and his own competence as Harold's primary advocate. He found Harold in the same emergency room where the blood transfusion crisis had occurred just 5 weeks earlier, conscious but clearly in pain, his face pale against the white hospital pillow. Denise sat in the visitor's chair beside his bed, holding his hand with the same calm presence she had shown throughout his recovery, her expression worried but not panicked. "What happened?" Marcus asked, though he was looking at Denise rather than the medical staff, recognizing that she would have observed details that might not appear in the clinical assessment. "He got up too quickly from his afternoon nap," she explained, her voice steady, despite the obvious strain of the situation. "I heard him call out from upstairs and found him on the bathroom floor beside his walker. I knew not to try to move him, so I called 911 immediately and stayed with him until the paramedics arrived. He was conscious the whole time, asking me to call you and making sure I had his insurance information." The X-rays revealed a hairline fracture in Harold's left hip, an injury that wouldn't require surgical repair, but would mean 6 to 8 weeks of severely limited mobility and intensive rehabilitation. As Marcus listened to Dr. Chen explain the treatment plan, he felt the weight of John and Patricia's warnings about the inadequacy of home care for someone with Harold's complex medical needs. "He can go home, Doctor," Chen said, reviewing the discharge instructions with careful attention to details that would determine the success of Harold's recovery. "But he'll need round-the-clock supervision for at least the first 2 weeks. Falls are a serious risk with hip injuries at his age, and he'll need help with basic activities like bathing, dressing, and mobility. We can arrange for visiting physical therapy, but someone needs to be with him constantly to ensure he doesn't try to do too much too soon." John and Patricia arrived at the hospital within an hour, having been called through the family communication network that Marcus still didn't fully understand. Their position was predictable, but not unreasonable. Harold's fall proved that home care was inadequate for someone with his combination of cognitive impairment and physical vulnerability, and he needed to be moved to a facility with trained staff and proper medical supervision immediately. "This wouldn't have happened with professional caregivers," John said quietly, pulling Marcus aside while Harold was being prepared for discharge. "Denise did her best, and we're grateful she was there to help him, but she's not trained to prevent falls or manage the complex care requirements of someone recovering from a hip injury. This is exactly what we were worried about." Marcus found himself torn between competing loyalties and conflicting evidence. John's argument was logical and supported by medical expertise, but it also dismissed the month of successful recovery that had preceded this setback. Harold had been improving steadily under Denise's care, regaining cognitive function and physical strength that had seemed permanently lost during his hospitalization. One accident, however unfortunate, didn't necessarily invalidate the entire approach to his care. The decision about Harold's immediate future was made by Harold himself, in a conversation that surprised everyone present. After listening to the medical discharge instructions and the family debate about care options, Harold requested a private consultation with Denise, asking everyone else to step outside while they discussed his preferences and concerns. Marcus, John, and Patricia waited in the hospital hallway for 15 minutes, each of them trying to guess what Harold might be saying to the woman who had become the center of their family's care decisions. When they returned to Harold's room, his choice was clear and non-negotiable. "I'm going home," he announced with the authority of someone who understood both the risks and the alternatives. "Denise will coordinate with visiting nurses and physical therapists to manage my medical needs. If this arrangement doesn't work effectively, I'll reconsider other options in 30 days. But for now, I'm going home to recover in familiar surroundings with care from someone I trust." John tried to argue, but Harold cut him off with a gesture that belonged to the corporate executive he had been for 50 years, a hand movement that had once silenced boardroom disagreements and ended hostile negotiations. "This is my decision," he said firmly. "I'm still mentally competent as doctor. Morrison's recent evaluation confirms. I understand the risks of home care, and I understand the alternatives. I choose to go home." The next month tested everyone's resolve and revealed the true complexity of caring for someone with Harold's combination of physical limitations and cognitive challenges. His mobility was severely restricted by the hip injury, requiring assistance with tasks that had been routine just weeks before. His frustration with these physical limitations sometimes triggered episodes of cognitive confusion that worried everyone involved in his care. There were difficult days when Denise had to help Harold with personal needs that embarrassed him, moments when his pride collided with his physical limitations in ways that required patience and diplomacy that went far beyond basic medical care. There were nights when his pain medication made him disoriented and demanding, when he forgot where he was or became convinced that he was late for business meetings that had been cancelled decades earlier. Marcus watched this process with growing admiration for Denise's competence and growing awareness of his own assumptions about the nature of care work. He began to understand that what his family had categorized as just housekeeping was actually complex emotional and practical labor that required intelligence, judgment, and psychological strength that he had never learned to recognize or value appropriately. The turning point in Harold's recovery came during his 7th week at home, when Marcus arrived from work to find his grandfather sitting at his mahogany desk in the study, reviewing financial documents with the kind of focused concentration he hadn't shown since before his original hospitalization. The afternoon light from the tall windows illuminated the papers spread across the desk surface, quarterly reports, and market analyses that required the kind of complex reasoning that had seemed beyond Harold's current cognitive capacity. "How are you feeling today, Grandad?" Marcus asked, settling into the leather chair beside the desk that had been his place during childhood conversations about business, family, and the responsibilities that would eventually become his inheritance. "Better than I have in months," Harold replied, his voice carrying clarity and energy that Marcus hadn't heard since before the medical crisis that had changed everything. Clear-headed, focused, ready to think seriously about the company's future. "I've been reviewing our quarterly results and thinking about the federal settlement requirements, about what we need to change, and how we can turn regulatory compliance into competitive advantage." For the next hour, Harold laid out his analysis of Wellington Industries' labor practices and his vision for the employee welfare fund that was required by their agreement with federal investigators. His thinking was sophisticated and strategic, connecting regulatory requirements to market opportunities in ways that demonstrated not just recovered cognitive function, but innovative insight that exceeded what he had been capable of before his medical crisis. "We've been approaching this settlement all wrong," Harold said, his voice gaining strength as he articulated ideas that had clearly been developing over weeks of careful consideration. "The government wants us to spend money on employee benefits, and we've been treating that requirement like a financial penalty, a cost we have to absorb to avoid criminal prosecution. But what if we restructured our thinking and made employee welfare a competitive advantage instead of a regulatory burden? Marcus leaned forward, recognizing that his grandfather was outlining something more ambitious than simple compliance with federal requirements. What do you mean, specifically? Harold smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had solved a complex problem through sustained intellectual effort. Look at what Denise has accomplished with my care. She's not just providing services according to a predetermined schedule. She's invested in the outcome because she understands that my recovery affects her own success and satisfaction. She pays attention to details that medical professionals miss because she's present for the daily realities that determine whether treatment actually works. The conversation continued for another hour as Harold explained his vision for restructuring the Federal Settlement Fund as an employee-owned benefit cooperative that would give Wellington Industries workers ownership stakes in their own healthcare, retirement security, and professional development. The plan was innovative, legally complex, and potentially transformative for the company's relationship with its workforce. But implementing Harold's vision would require his active participation in board meetings, legal negotiations, and strategic planning sessions that would test his cognitive capacity under pressure and in public settings where his competence would be scrutinized by people who had legitimate concerns about his ability to make binding decisions for a company that employed over 2,000 people across 3 states. The first board meeting Harold attended since his medical crisis was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November, when Atlanta's autumn weather had turned crisp and clear, with golden leaves from the oak trees surrounding the downtown headquarters building scattered across sidewalks still damp from an early morning rain shower. Marcus arrived at the Wellington Industries building an hour before the meeting, carrying his grandfather's files and ensuring that the conference room was arranged to accommodate Harold's walker and the physical limitations that were now permanent features of his daily life. The resistance Marcus encountered from some board members was subtle but unmistakable, rooted in conversations that John had been having with directors who had legitimate concerns about Harold's capacity to lead the company through the complex implementation of federal regulatory requirements. These were not hostile or political objections, but professional worries about fiduciary responsibility and corporate governance in a situation where the majority owner's cognitive function had been compromised by medical trauma. Margaret Foster, the board's longest-serving independent director and a respected attorney who had worked with the Wellington family for over 20 years, expressed the concerns that several other directors shared, but were reluctant to voice directly. "We all support Harold's recovery and want to see him involved in company decisions to whatever extent is appropriate," she said during the pre-meeting consultation with Marcus. "But we also have responsibilities to shareholders, employees, and regulatory agencies that require us to ensure that major decisions are made with full cognitive capacity and sound judgment." Marcus felt the familiar frustration of being 19 years old in a room full of people who had known him since childhood, people who remembered him as the grieving 8-year-old at his parents' funeral rather than the young executive he was trying to become. But he also felt a new kind of confidence based on months of observing Harold's recovery and learning to distinguish between different types of cognitive ability. "Harold's judgment isn't impaired," Marcus said with conviction that surprised him with its strength. "His processing speed is different from what it was before his medical crisis, and his short-term memory has some gaps that require accommodation. But his analytical thinking, strategic reasoning, and business instincts are not just intact. They may actually be sharper than they were before, because he's learned to focus on essential issues rather than getting distracted by peripheral details." Margaret looked skeptical, her expression reflecting years of legal experience with corporate governance issues and family business disputes. "With all due respect, Marcus, you're not qualified to make clinical assessments of cognitive capacity. We need objective professional evaluation, not family loyalty. You're right that I'm not qualified to make clinical assessments, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the challenge to his credibility. But Dr. Morrison is qualified, and his evaluation supports Harold's legal competency and decision-making capacity. More importantly, the results speak for themselves. Harold designed the employee benefit cooperative that addresses every concern raised by federal auditors while positioning Wellington Industries as an industry leader instead of a regulatory target. That level of strategic innovation doesn't come from impaired judgment. Monsieur, when Harold entered the conference room, moving carefully with his walker, but dressed in the navy wool suit that had been his uniform for important business meetings throughout Marcus's childhood, the dynamics in the room shifted immediately. He took his place at the head of the polished mahogany table with quiet authority, arranging his notes with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned to compensate for physical limitations without appearing diminished by them. For the next 90 minutes, Harold presented his employee cooperative plan with a combination of technical precision and strategic vision that reminded everyone present why he had built Wellington Industries from a small family construction company into a regional powerhouse that competed successfully against much larger corporate rivals. His presentation was methodical and comprehensive, addressing implementation challenges, financial projections, regulatory compliance requirements, and competitive advantages with the kind of detailed analysis that had characterized his leadership throughout 5 decades of business success. The questions that followed tested both Harold's command of specific details and his ability to think strategically under pressure from directors who were genuinely trying to assess his cognitive capacity rather than simply challenging his authority. Marcus watched the board members' initial skepticism transform into engaged curiosity as Harold demonstrated not just competence, but innovative thinking that exceeded their expectations for someone who had recently suffered significant medical trauma. Robert Chen, the chief financial officer who had worked with Harold for 15 years, posed the most challenging questions about implementation costs and projected returns on the cooperative investment. This is the most ambitious restructuring we've considered since the company went public, he said, reviewing Harold's financial projections with the careful attention of someone who understood that wrong decisions could affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in shareholder value. The upfront costs are substantial, the legal complexity is significant, and the long-term benefits depend on employee engagement levels that we can't guarantee. Harold nodded, acknowledging the validity of Chen's concerns, without appearing defensive about criticism of his proposal. "Everything worthwhile involves risk and uncertainty," he replied. "The question isn't whether this plan is guaranteed to succeed, but whether we want Wellington Industries to be known as a company that does the minimum required by law or as a company that leads by example in creating innovative solutions to industry-wide challenges." By the meeting's end, the board had voted unanimously to move forward with Harold's employee cooperative plan, but the significance of the decision extended far beyond corporate policy. The directors had also voted to formalize Marcus's role as Chief Operating Officer, recognizing that his coordination of Harold's care and his contributions to developing the cooperative had demonstrated executive capability that transcended his age and formal experience. The success of the board meeting created momentum for changes that affected not just Wellington Industries' business strategy, but the family relationships that had been strained by months of medical crisis and recovery. Harold's cognitive function had stabilized at a level that allowed him to work part-time and maintain significant involvement in company decisions. But it also required acknowledgement that his capacity would never return to what it had been before his health crisis. This reality forced conversations about succession planning, responsibility sharing, and the difference between inherited authority and earned leadership that had been postponed throughout Marcus's teenage years. Harold's medical crisis had accelerated a transition that might otherwise have taken place gradually over several years, compressing the process of leadership development into months of intense learning under pressure. "You've grown up during these past few months," Harold told Marcus one evening as they reviewed implementation timelines for the employee cooperative in the study that had been the center of family business discussions throughout Marcus's childhood. "Not just gotten older, but actually matured in ways that matter for leadership. You've learned to see people clearly instead of just seeing their roles, to recognize competence wherever it exists rather than only where you expect to find it." Marcus understood that his grandfather was talking about more than just business leadership development. His relationship with Denise had evolved from the traditional employer-employee dynamic into something more complex and mutually respectful, based on recognition of her expertise rather than simple gratitude for her services. He had learned to distinguish between credentials and competence, between inherited authority and earned respect, between managing people and leading them. That recognition became public during Wellington Industries' annual shareholders meeting in December, held in the hotel ballroom where the company had celebrated major milestones and announced significant developments throughout its 50-year history. Marcus had invited Denise to attend as his personal guest, partly because he wanted her to witness the presentation of the employee cooperative program that had grown from Harold's insights about effective care, and partly because he believed she deserved public acknowledgement for contributions that had influenced the company's strategic direction. The meeting included detailed presentations about the Employee Benefit Cooperative and its pilot implementation across 3 company divisions, with projected expansion to all Wellington Industries operations over the following 18 months. When Harold described the philosophical foundation of the program, the principle that effective care and sustainable productivity both require genuine investment in relationships rather than just systems and procedures, he looked directly at Denise in the audience, acknowledging her role in developing ideas that would affect thousands of families. "This program exists because I learned something important during my own recovery from serious medical trauma," Harold said, his voice carrying clearly through the hotel ballroom's sound system to an audience of shareholders, employees, and business partners who represented the full scope of Wellington Industries' community impact. "Competence isn't always found where traditional credentials suggest you should look for it, and the most valuable expertise often comes from people who are close enough to problems to understand them completely and personally." After the formal presentations concluded, several Wellington Industries employees approached Denise to thank her personally for her role in developing benefit programs that would provide their families with healthcare security, retirement savings, and professional development opportunities that exceeded industry standards. Marcus watched these interactions with a mixture of pride in Denise's achievements and embarrassment about how long it had taken him to recognize contributions that had been essential to both Harold's recovery and the company's strategic innovation. The formal recognition came 3 weeks later, when Harold announced the creation of the Employee Care Excellence Program with Denise as its founding director, a position that came with a salary reflecting the value of her expertise, an office in the corporate headquarters building, and responsibility for training care coordinators who would work with other companies interested in implementing similar approaches to employee welfare and family support services. "But I don't have a college degree in healthcare administration or human resources management," Denise said when Harold offered her the position during one of the Thursday evening dinners that had become a weekly tradition in the Buckhead mansion. "People are going to question my qualifications for a corporate leadership role, especially other companies who might want to hire us as consultants." Harold set down his coffee cup, the same blue ceramic mug that Denise had served him every morning for 3 years, and looked at her with the expression of someone who had spent months thinking carefully about competence, credentials, and the difference between formal qualifications and proven results. People questioned my qualifications when I started this company 50 years ago, he replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had built success through competence rather than inherited advantage. I was 25 years old, with more ambition than experience, more ideas than capital, and more confidence than common sense probably justified. But I learned that real competence is about producing results that matter, not about having credentials that look impressive on paper. You've produced results that literally saved my life and fundamentally changed how this company thinks about employee welfare and community responsibility. Marcus added his own perspective, recognizing that Denise's expertise had been developed through experience that no academic program could have provided. You've been managing complex care coordination for months, working with medical professionals, insurance companies, family members, and business executives to solve problems that trained specialists couldn't solve. You've developed methods that work because you pay attention to details that matter to real people in real situations. That's not luck or intuition. That's expertise gained through sustained attention and genuine care. Denise accepted the position with the same quiet competence she had brought to every responsibility throughout Harold's recovery, immediately beginning to develop training protocols and consultation services that would help other families and companies navigate care decisions with attention to individual dignity and practical effectiveness rather than just institutional convenience and cost control. Drop a quick like if you're rooting for care that looks like this in real life. The Employee Care Excellence Program's first major validation came 6 months later, when Wellington Industries was selected as a case study by Harvard Business School's program in innovative employee benefit design and corporate social responsibility. The cooperative had reduced company healthcare costs by 15%, while improving employee satisfaction scores to the highest levels in Wellington Industries' history, results that attracted attention from business schools, consulting firms, and companies across the Southeast who were struggling with similar challenges in workforce management and regulatory compliance. The Harvard research team spent a week in Atlanta interviewing Harold, Marcus, Denise, and dozens of Wellington Industries employees about the program's development, implementation, and measurable outcomes. The resulting case study, titled Care as Competitive Advantage, Transforming Regulatory Compliance into Strategic Innovation, became required reading in several MBA programs and generated consulting requests from companies that wanted to replicate Wellington Industries' approach to employee welfare and community engagement. But the recognition that meant the most to Denise came from an unexpected source when Dr. Morrison, the neurologist who had evaluated Harold's cognitive capacity during his recovery, called to ask if she would be willing to consult with other families who were navigating similar care decisions for elderly relatives with complex medical and cognitive needs. "I've been following Harold's progress for the past year," Dr. Morrison explained during a follow-up appointment in his medical office overlooking Piedmont Park, where autumn leaves were beginning to turn red and gold in the warm October sunlight. "What you've accomplished isn't just successful home care, it's a replicable model for how families can maintain dignity and independence while managing serious health challenges. I have other patients who could benefit from your approach, families who are struggling with the same kinds of decisions that Harold and Marcus faced." This led to Denise's expanded role as a consultant with families throughout the Atlanta metropolitan area who were trying to balance medical needs with personal preferences, institutional care with home-based support, professional services with family involvement. Her approach which emphasized maintaining familiar routines, respecting individual preferences, and creating environments that supported existing strengths rather than focusing primarily on deficits and limitations, proved effective across a wide range of conditions and family circumstances. A year after Harold's original hospitalization and blood transfusion crisis, the changes in the Wellington family structure and company operations had become permanent features of their new normal rather than temporary accommodations to medical emergency. Harold worked 3 days a week at the downtown office and spent the remaining days at home, managing his health with the same strategic thinking he had once applied to business challenges, treating his cognitive limitations as problems to be solved rather than defeats to be endured. Marcus had grown into his role as Chief Operating Officer with confidence that came from making difficult decisions under pressure and learning to recognize competence and leadership potential in people whose backgrounds didn't match traditional corporate expectations. His management style reflected lessons learned during Harold's recovery, that effective leadership requires seeing people clearly rather than just seeing their roles, that innovation often emerges from unexpected sources, and that treating employees with genuine respect produces better results than relying solely on hierarchical authority and financial incentives. Denise had become a recognized expert in Atlanta's elder care community, training home health aides, consulting with families facing difficult care decisions, speaking at conferences about dignity-centered approaches to aging and disability, and influencing policy discussions at the state level about community-based alternatives to institutional care. Her work had earned recognition from professional organizations that had never previously acknowledged the expertise of domestic workers, and her methods were being studied by researchers interested in scalable approaches to family caregiving support. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in the relationships between these three people who had been brought together by medical crisis and had discovered that their assumptions about class, race, competence and care had been fundamentally incomplete and limiting. They had learned that genuine respect requires seeing people's full humanity rather than just their social roles, that effective leadership means recognizing expertise wherever it exists rather than only where credentials suggest it should be found, and that the most important qualifications for caring for others are sustained attention, patient persistence, and willingness to invest personally in another person's well-being and success. On a warm Tuesday evening in late spring, exactly 18 months after Harold's medical crisis and Denise's anonymous blood donation, the three of them sat on the back porch of the Buckhead mansion, sharing a dinner that Denise had prepared and watching the sun set over Atlanta's expanding skyline, where construction cranes marked the city's continued growth and transformation. Harold was reviewing applications for the Employee Care Excellence Program's expansion to companies in Birmingham and Nashville. Marcus was studying preliminary reports from Harvard researchers who were developing a replication guide for other family businesses interested in implementing similar employee cooperative programs. Denise was preparing a presentation for the Georgia Association of Home Care Workers about professional development opportunities for domestic and care workers. The conversation that evening ranged across topics that would have been impossible to discuss 18 months earlier. The relationship between formal education and practical expertise, the ways that medical crises can reveal both individual character and systemic problems, the difference between gratitude and respect in employer-employee relationships, and the challenge of creating business policies that reflect genuine care for employee welfare rather than just compliance with regulatory requirements. "Do you ever think about that night at the hospital?" Marcus asked, breaking a comfortable silence that had settled over the porch as darkness began to gather in the oak trees that surrounded the mansion's carefully maintained grounds. "Every day," Harold replied thoughtfully. Not the medical crisis itself, which was frightening but temporary, but what came afterward. How much we all learned about each other and about ourselves during the recovery process. How many assumptions we had to examine and change. Denise looked up from her presentation notes, her expression reflecting the same thoughtful consideration that had characterized her approach to Harold's care throughout his recovery. I think about how scared we all were that night, and how we didn't realize then that being scared together, facing uncertainty together, was the beginning of becoming a real family instead of just people who happened to live in the same house and work for the same company. Marcus nodded, recognizing the truth of her observation about the difference between proximity and genuine relationship, between formal roles and actual care. I keep thinking about assumptions and how wrong I was about so many things. What competence actually looks like, what qualifications really mean, what it takes to care for someone effectively over time, how much I had to learn about paying attention to people rather than just managing them. Harold shifted in his chair, his movement still careful but no longer hesitant, reflecting the physical therapy and adaptive strategies that had become routine parts of his daily life. The hardest lesson for me was learning that being grateful isn't the same as being respectful. I was grateful for Denise's care from the very beginning, from that first night when she donated her blood to save my life. But it took me months to move beyond gratitude to genuine respect for her expertise and judgment. Gratitude can still be condescending if it doesn't acknowledge the other person's full capability and professional competence. They continued talking as full darkness settled over the city. Three people whose lives had been permanently changed by a medical emergency that had revealed both their individual strengths and the transformative power of genuine partnership across differences that had once seemed insurmountable, but had proven to be opportunities for learning and growth rather than barriers to understanding and cooperation. The Employee Care Excellence Program continued expanding throughout the Southeast, serving as a model for similar initiatives that attracted attention from policymakers interested in innovative approaches to workforce development, family support services, and community-based elder care. Denise's consulting practice evolved into a training institute that prepared care coordinators for families and companies throughout the region, establishing professional standards for work that had previously been invisible and undervalued. Marcus's leadership of Wellington Industries reflected the management philosophy he had developed during Harold's recovery, that effective leadership requires recognizing and developing talent wherever it exists, that sustainable innovation often comes from unexpected sources and unconventional perspectives, and that treating people with genuine respect and investment in their success produces measurably better results than relying primarily on traditional hierarchies, formal credentials, and financial incentives. Harold's health stabilized at a level that allowed him to remain actively involved in company strategy, while acknowledging physical and cognitive limitations with the same practical problem-solving approach that had built his business success. He became a sought-after speaker on topics ranging from succession planning and family business management to age-friendly workplace design and innovative employee benefit structures, always emphasizing that competence and wisdom don't disappear with physical changes, but may require new forms of expression and institutional support. The blood donation that had initiated this transformation was never forgotten, but it became just one element of a larger story about what becomes possible when people learn to see each other clearly enough to recognize both vulnerability and strength, both need and capability, both individual limitation and collective potential. It became a story about how crisis can reveal not just who people really are in their essential character, but who they're capable of becoming when they're supported by genuine respect, practical assistance, and sustained investment in their success and well-being. Years later, when business school students studied the Wellington Industries case in corporate strategy and organizational behavior courses, They focused primarily on the measurable outcomes that had made the company a model for others. Improved employee satisfaction scores, reduced healthcare costs, enhanced productivity metrics, and successful regulatory compliance that had been transformed from legal burden into competitive advantage. But for Harold, Marcus, and Denise, the real lesson was both simpler and more profound than anything that could be quantified in quarterly reports or academic case studies. They had learned that paying attention to people's actual abilities rather than their formal credentials, treating them with genuine respect rather than condescending gratitude, and investing personally in their success and well-being creates value that changes everything about how business gets conducted and how families care for each other across differences in age, race, class, and formal education. The mansion in Buckhead remained their shared home, but the relationships within it had been fundamentally transformed by the recognition that competence, wisdom, and care come in forms that don't always match traditional expectations or social assumptions. They had discovered that the most important qualifications for any significant role, whether as a caregiver, a business leader, or a family member, are the willingness to see clearly beyond surface appearances, the courage to act on what you observe rather than what you expect, and the persistence to keep learning from the people around you, regardless of their formal credentials or social position.